My name is Ashley, and this is Let's Talk Dispatch.
I do. You're gonna do it. Do it really well.
And I believe the world needs more dispatchers.
Around in the mud, blood, and beer.
Years that I'm not working 4th of July. 4th of July.
Say community policing, right? What about community dispatching?
So on this show, with the help of my guests, we will educate, empower, and support the heroes behind the headset. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode here at Let's Talk Dispatch with me, Ashley, the raspy dispatcher. I actually just got back from a weekend trip with my fiance and one of my old teammates from college, Allie. She just had her first kid about 6 months ago, and she was like, please take me for a weekend. So we all got together and we drove up to Reno. And although I did not win enough money to retire, I am up $100, so I'm going to take that as a win going into my next work week. I did tell my work that I wouldn't be returning, so I think they'll be surprised when I show back up the shift. So everyone, today we're going to be talking about the call that a dispatcher never wants to take, always has to be prepared to handle, and honestly and unfortunately is just becoming more and more common, active shooter situations. My guest today is a retired Connecticut State Police officer and founder of the RAK Academy, and they're here today to talk about shaving seconds to save lives in an active killer incident. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Ashley, and congratulations. Do you have a wedding date picked out and everything?
Oh, no wedding date yet. We're just kind of rolling in it. You know, we live out here in California, so our first instinct is like, we got to buy a house.
Yeah, good call. Good call.
The housing market's wild out here, so we're going to do that first and then kind of go from there.
Awesome. Well, congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I thought you were congratulating me on my $100 win. Do you see where my mind? I told my supervisor, I was like, look, I don't know if I'm going to be back Thursday because I might just hit the big pot. And I did not.
That's a fair heads up. You know,
I know, right? I think it's polite.
I'm always wondering when I'm driving along the highway and they announce the winning lottery numbers for, a $5 billion thing. I'm like, I don't know if I want to be driving next to that guy or that woman when she figures out that she's won, right?
Yeah, seriously. Oh, man. So, Dan, tell us a little bit how you got into public safety and a little bit about your journey.
Sure. I, like many people, I just thought that it would have great purpose. I initially had gone to college for advertising, and I quickly found out that, sales was not my strong point, and I just wanted something with some more purpose. So I ended up joining the Army National Guard, and long story short, that kind of led me into law enforcement. And I'd like to say that I had it all planned out and knew exactly what I was getting into, but I really didn't. I was very fortunate to get on with, what I believe is one of the best agencies across the country for a lot of different reasons. So I was just very fortunate to get on with the Connecticut State Police and have the experiences that I did, and then be able to retire both physically healthy and I believe mentally healthy and move on to some other things.
That is awesome. It's funny. I just interviewed with someone who works as a dispatcher in Maine, and I guess their retirement system is group-based, and their state troopers are in Group 3, and they only have to serve like 25 years, and then they're eligible for retirement.
Sure.
And I'm like, that's amazing.
Well, what's more amazing is we only did 20. So I actually
I'm in the wrong career.
I did 23, so you can stay longer. And our group troopers now, unfortunately, have to do 25. It's still a great retirement system, but it's one of the largest pieces of advice that I give to somebody that wants to go into law enforcement is I say, don't just look at all the cool Gucci stuff, like really dig into what their healthcare package is, what their retirement package is, and how long you have to do, because that extra 5 or 10 years is an absolute kick in the butt in this profession. And, when you're 20, 25 and you're just looking to do some real good things, but have some adventure, you don't pay attention to those things. But 10, 15 years later, once you've got a family and you're thinking about what you want to do afterwards and you want to make some some movements, either lateral, because you want to change jobs, but within the same agency, or you want to make promotion. That's it can be very restrictive if you didn't choose the right place. So it's one of my biggest recommendations is really just digging into the deeper things of that agency that you're looking into.
It is true. And even if you're going into dispatch, one of the big things is like, you're right. When at 20, 25, you're like, I'm going to be working for X amount of years. I don't need to worry about
Right.
retirement or, anything like that. But it is so true that if you do worry about it and you really are intentional about understanding the retirement that you're going into, or even when you're job searching, it's going to make life a lot easier down the road when you're heading out the door for any reason.
Yeah, I would even recommend, instead of just looking at the bottom line, which is pretty much what everybody was looking at, was what the salary is.
Mm-hmm.
If you can retire 5 or 10 or 15 years earlier, even if you take a lesser salary, depending on what the calculation of it is, that's probably a win-win for you and your family afterwards. So there's a lot to look into that. And I'm still not the right person to actually know all those numbers. I just know that I got lucky. I really do.
Yeah. And it's funny because I just watched like a Instagram, some social media nonsense the other day that someone was talking about compensation. And when you think about your salary, that benefits is part of your compensation packet. Like, I think, like you said, a lot of us are like, okay, how much is my check going to be every month? But in reality, all those things pour into that bucket and do ultimately impact, our livelihood down the road. So I think it's super important.
Yeah, I'll tell you just 2 big things of our pension, right? Not only do we collect immediately, but we have free healthcare for life for ourselves and our spouse and our family up till 26. But we also get a COLA, so a cost of living increase based on inflation, which fortunately has been pretty high, but fortunately it's actually been pretty high for us. So, those 2 things, as I travel across the country and I talk to people and we have sidebars, are 2 game changers is, the cost of health insurance. So the fact that you have that, and the fact that you have a COLA, so your pension is going to continue to grow, hopefully with the rate of inflation. So
very cool. I know that number 26, man, when I turned 26 and I got that letter that said, you're no longer on your dad's city insurance. Right. And then I had to look and see how much medical costs. And I was just like, what in the world? Happy birthday.
You're right.
Man, that 26 is a tough number. So we were talking a little bit before offline that for you at your department when you worked there, you folks also had a rotation or a patrol position as a dispatcher or working the desk. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so one of the unique things and one of the reasons why I really enjoyed working with the Connecticut State Police is we are fairly unique compared to the majority of police departments across the agency. We don't just run the highway by any means. We have so many local towns that are so rural or so small that they don't have any police departments at all. So therefore, a state trooper will just, for a patrol that day, will cover probably 3 of those towns all by themselves, which means we handle everything on patrol from the cat in the tree to a low-level sex assault. So that means that we're very much fulfilling the role and getting the experience as many of the local police departments do, right? We get that investigative experience, and certainly we handle the highways as well. So we deal with that. But we also, one of our patrol assignments every single day at each one of our troops throughout the state is for at least one desk trooper to sit the desk with our dispatchers. And we certainly don't do it as well as those dispatchers, but every single one of us straight out of the academy are desk certified. And, at some troops, it's a very senior position because those troopers would rather stay inside, not have to do the paperwork and, not have to field those calls. In other troops, it's actually a very junior position because, the troopers there, they just want to get out on the road and do that type of police work. But what it does mean is that, we put on the headset every single day and get that experience. And I think have a very good appreciation for what dispatch does. We actually have as part of not only do our dispatchers, right? We have an 8-week dispatcher academy where our dispatchers have to go through, regardless of if they've been a dispatcher somewhere else, they've got to still go through our 8-week dispatch academy.
Mhm.
And our dispatchers that run that academy, they actually train our recruits on the recruit level. So they come in and they educate them about what dispatch is. And then part of our FTO program is you have to spend, I believe it's about a half a day in dispatch. So you have to sit there and just get used to the environment about what's going on. The fact that dispatch could be blown up and very, chaotic, even though the radio may sound very quiet. And so they really get the experience and understanding. And I think that helps for a better analysis, which is, where I led into, but also just a better understanding and appreciation for what you guys do, because the reality is I think you're undervalued and you're undertrained.
Thank you. No, I really do think that's a very unique, because I've worked at 2 agencies, both city police, and I think every officer that I've ever come into contact with, they're just like, oh no, I could never do this job. Like your guys' job is wild. It's just so different from, our side of the radio. And the fact that for you and your department, that even more than just having someone sit in during their training, like you guys are actually trained to do that part of the job. I think it definitely helps with that patrol dispatch relationship, because you guys get it. You know what I mean? Like I don't have to explain to you, like you said, the radio might be the word we don't say, but inside, I'm fielding, 400 calls or some craziness. Having that understanding, I think, goes a long way for a dispatcher.
Yeah, and some of our best patrol troopers are ones that were dispatchers first, and then actually, moved over to be troopers. We actually had a dispatcher who then came to the sworn side and retired as a lieutenant colonel. So
wow, very cool.
They certainly deserve a lot more appreciation, but I think we give more appreciation than most.
Awesome. Well, let's talk a little bit about RAK Academy, how that started, and what's your mission with that?
Sure. Well, the majority of my career was as a detective in our major crime squad. And during that time, I was assigned as the lead investigator for the Sandy Hook school shooting. So up until that, I, certainly had some training, and we had a previous active shooter incident in a few years before in our state. But obviously Sandy Hook took it to a whole different level. And as the case officer, I was then often requested to go around and give talks at conferences and things like that, and share lessons learned, which is something we absolutely have to do. But what I found is, as I started giving presentation after presentation, especially if they were limited in time, I mean, because you could talk for days as far as the lessons learned across the board for Sandy Hook. But anytime that I was limited in time, I found myself struggling with what to present, right? So what to keep in and what to cut out. And so I had sat in those seats and been briefed on the O.J. Simpson case and the Casey Anthony case and, all these high profile cases. And oftentimes we spend hours talking about the case and showing photos and talking about details, but we don't give enough takeaways, right? How does that really make me a better detective going back the next day instead of just knowing the story? So I really committed to not just telling the story of Sandy Hook, but making sure that there was some purpose and some skill building that was going to come out of it. And as I started looking more about what I talked about, which was, I certainly had a focus on command post operations and detective specific stuff and what those first responders on the scene showing up should be doing and school safety and all these different aspects. I found that the most important thing was dispatch. It was not only the most important because they had the most opportunity to save lives, but it was the most important because it's the most overlooked. And some of that was just coming down to some simple math. And what we know is that Newtown officers were on scene in about 3.5 minutes at Sandy Hook. And we believe, even though he didn't leave a suicide note or a manifesto, but because of his strong social anxiety, it was it was really illogical to believe that he ever thought that he could live on his own, that he could get away, or that he could actually, maybe try and take the fight to law enforcement or get captured and live in incarceration. Like, he had such strong social anxieties that at this point in his life, he really, couldn't have lived anywhere else with anybody else than where he was living. And before he did the school shooting, he had already killed his mother. So it just makes sense that his plan all along was to kill himself, and to do that before there was any chance of him getting taken alive, which when you look in the data, we find that that's usually the answer about 43% of the time, right? That these types of active killers, just presence of law enforcement alone will cause them to either commit suicide, to flee, to barricade, hopefully in a way that we're not still losing people, or to maybe take the fight to us. And in all those instances, as soon as police officers get on scene, we have some positive effect on the situation and usually stop the killing, or at least slow it down. But when dispatchers are taking those initial calls, no one's usually on scene yet, and no one knows about it. And if they are not trained specifically about what to do with those calls, especially if they do what they normally do by habit and sometimes by policy with so many other calls, then we're going to give away some valuable seconds, and we're going to look back and realize that we could have saved lives. If he truly had a plan to just commit suicide once police got there, they got there in 3.5 minutes. But the simple question is, what if we got him there in 3 minutes? That would have been a half a minute less of trigger squeezes. And our number wouldn't be at 26. And that has nothing to do with what we usually spend the majority of our training on, which is hallway movements and room entries, right? And although that stuff is important, if it doesn't come into play probably half the time, then we're missing this whole opportunity to save lives just to figure out how to get our people on scene quicker. That obviously falls usually in the hands of dispatch. So,
it's go ahead.
So from that's where the RAK Academy really originated, is instead of just doing presentations and giving talks, I started doing specific training. My last 7 years of the state police, I retired. I was an instructor at the academy. And then I also did 20 years in the military where I was instructor certified. So I know a lot about what actually makes a difference in training, and it's not somebody standing up talking, right? It's actually us doing good scenario-based training, developing muscle memory, overriding bad habits, and so that's where the RAK Academy developed, because I started, even though I still do talks, I started developing very specific scenario-based training all the way across the board, from school or church or business safety, to dispatchers taking the calls, to police officers that are showing up on the scene. And they all include just doing good reps. So in our 2-day dispatch response to active killers, our DRAC, we actually do scenario-based training for those dispatchers after we've taught them the important things to do. And we set up mock dispatch stations, and we have you take mock active shooter calls, and we put you really on the only thing that matters, which is the clock, as far as getting things done.
So interesting. It's for me, like when I grew up, the Columbine had happened. Like that was the first, not the first, but in my childhood, that was the big incident where it was like, oh wow, this never happens, and I can't believe this could be such a thing at schools, and and now I'm 32 years old, and Sandy Hook happened, and there's so many other school shootings and active shooting incidents in general that are happening, that it's so commonplace now, where the shock and awe of it has dwindled from like my memory as far as when Columbine happened versus when shootings happen now. It's one of those like, man, another one,
Sure.
And I think the perspective also shifts for me because now I am a dispatcher. And like you said, when dispatchers when the call comes in, no one knows about it yet.
Right.
You know, I don't for folks who don't dispatch, and when there is any type of in progress, high priority, violent call, such as a shooting, we're kind of trained to drop a call with a location and like a word, you know, that it's happening here at Sandy Hook, shooting, boom, and we're rolling. So the person who is dispatching those officers are trained to get them going with no info, you know, like as fast as we can, we're getting more info. And of course, for a situation like an active shooter, you're going to get a lot more calls. And the other side of it that I wouldn't have thought of before I did this job is the fact that when these places happen in small rural communities,
Sure.
their dispatch centers are reflective of that. So you have two people, maybe more likely one, you know, fielding hundreds of calls with probably multiple injuries and limited information. So it is really a disservice if a department is providing active shooter training only to their officers who are responding on scene.
Yeah, I would actually argue that their presence alone has that positive, the positive effects, which is why I think the seconds that are in the hands of the dispatchers are more valuable and have more opportunity to save lives. And yet they get far less and usually actually no training that's really effective and specific. And you're right. The most important thing we can do once we get those two things, right? Significant event and general location, right? As soon as we get Sandy Hook shooting, we don't even need to wait for the caller to stop talking. We should dispatch officers. However, there's a lot of dynamics that happen, right? So they give that right answer in class when they're in a relaxed, controlled environment. But when you talk about the amount of shock and stress and doubt that happens when they take that once in a career call, a lot of times, unfortunately, we can go to YouTube right now and from Columbine all the way up to Uvalde, our most recent events, and we could see that those things oftentimes don't happen, unfortunately, right? Because we haven't trained our people enough under that level of stress or something close to it to be able to really be focused on those things. So we get into a thing called script writing, right? Which is, so we're going to map these things out and through classroom discussion, identify what the most important actions are to do and what's the most important transmissions to make and what ones are not important, because there's so much other stuff that we do a lot of times by habit, which aren't relevant in the middle of this, which are maybe relevant in a lot of other calls, but not in these calls. And, you know, it's such a controversial area, but just EMD, which every dispatcher is familiar with, right? We have to go down the road of trying to save lives by doing, treating somebody medically. But if you think about the prioritization that has to change with an active killer incident and relate it to our officers on scene, what are they doing when they get on scene and the killer's still active and they come across somebody that's bleeding out in the hallway?
They're moving. They're moving forward.
They're moving by them. So that same type of triage during those first 10 minutes, I'm not talking about 20 or 30 minutes into this, but while the killing is still going on, I argue that same type of triage has to happen for that dispatcher, because if they start going down the road of EMD and trying to treat a superficial or even a serious gunshot wound, they're trying to save one person. But meanwhile, like you said, that dispatch center is going to be overwhelmed. And that means we're dropping 911 calls. And if we're dropping those calls, then we're missing that key piece of information that they might have because we're trying to save one person. And just like your police officers, in that one type of call, they've got to step over somebody. There's some tough decisions that have to be made for our dispatchers. And that's where we really walk through and get everybody to think about it for the first time.
Yeah, and I would even go further to say that, for citizens who are listening who aren't in the field yet, and when you think about just the rate in which information travels now, especially in a school situation, where, you know, parents have their children there, they're worried about their kids, they're hearing, you know, their kid text them, telling them there's an active shooter situation, even if it is not confirmed, those parents start calling 911 as well.
Absolutely.
You know, so
Absolutely.
folks who aren't even on scene will start calling 911, telling us there's an active shooter situation. We have to field those calls too. Like, okay, you're not there. You don't have any information. Okay, we have to go. You know, so there is that aspect as well coming into the center for folks who are just scared and they don't know what to do and they want more information because for some information is calming rather than no information.
Sure. No, it's such a great point. We literally walk through all these different types of calls that you're going to have to handle in those first 10 minutes. And then we write scripts to figure out what's the best and what's the fastest thing that we can do with those calls. And those calls from those parents are right in the mix, along with a whole bunch of other checklists that your dispatcher's names are on, right? Calling for mutual aid, notifying the chief, like activating all these other things, which they usually do in so many other types of calls. But these types of calls are not only overwhelming your PSAP, they're overwhelming probably several other PSAPs. And if you don't know specifically what's the best thing for you to do right then, you're probably going to look back and wish that you made some other choices. So that's the experience that we focus on giving them in those 2 days.
That's awesome. So when you're going through this training and you're, you know, obviously we're not going to go through your whole training here on this episode, but what do you think specifically, if you could maybe narrow it down to a sentence or two, is the role of a dispatcher during that active shooter incident?
Sure. So I'll give you the initial script, right? So as we've already said, and we use Sandy Hook, we use active killer incidents as the pinnacle to really drive the point home. But when you think about it, it could be somebody with having a heart attack, an arterial bleed, or through the windshield of a car. Really, for any life-saving type situations, as soon as a dispatcher has those two things, significant event and a general location, dispatching assistance, whether it's the police officer, EMS, fire, is their top priority, right? And that means cutting off the caller. It means whether you're pushing a button or dispatching through CAD, whatever you're doing, if you don't do that right then, you give away seconds that it doesn't matter how fast those officers or those fire engines drive, they can never get those seconds back. So those two things, hit the button. Now we have a caller on the line and there's a lot of other information that we need to get. And oftentimes when I ask, if you get to ask one question, what's the most important question? There's such a wide array of questions that people want to ask of, you know, it's a shooter's name, a physical description, how many shooters, where the victims are. But really, when we look at these types of events, which are happening in large facilities or large areas, right? Because there's a lot of people there. That's where these active killer incidents are happening, which is not the majority of calls that we take. Whereas if you're a frequent flyer coming to my house, you just get the address and that you're good to go for location. But we need to get a more specific location of where the threat is, where the victim is, where the heart attack victim is, because if you just put out a general address, if you just put out one of your local colleges as far as an address and your police officers show up, how big is that campus, right? How big is that mall? And how much time, not just seconds, but how many minutes are they going to waste trying to figure out where that killer is? And that's where that falls in this concept of trying to shave as many seconds as possible. So the very first question to ask is, where specifically is the killer? Now, we don't need room 8, row 3, right? We don't need that something specific, especially because there's a good chance they're going to move. What we do need is Macy's instead of JCPenney, right? Your officers, by showing up fairly close to there, can end up closing the distance and shaving seconds and stopping the threat a lot quicker than if they parked all the way across campus or at the other end of the mall, or if they parked at the front of the school when really the shooting is going on in the soccer field down in the back.
Mhm.
And so not only is that the first and most important question, but when we get an answer, we've got to hit the button and put it out, right? It can't be the first of 10 questions and then we put all that information out together. It's that question is a standalone question. So
Mhm.
that I think is the most important script at the beginning. And it sounds so simple, which it is, right? It's simple to understand. It's just not simple to do under that much stress with that much responsibility. And because your habits under stress come back and take you down a different road because it's probably not what you do on the majority of your calls.
Mhm.
So there's a lot that we need to work through there. And it happens every single class where during the first day when we talk about concepts, the more senior dispatchers are getting all the answers right and their heads are nodding and they have all the confidence in the world. And when we actually set up the mock dispatch stations and we put them in those scenarios, their habits come back out. Even though they know the right answers, they start asking questions just like our dispatchers did at Sandy Hook and saying, what makes you think that? What else is going on there? And asking some irrelevant questions because that script has not been driven home enough for them. So that's really the beginning part. And I'm sure you're probably already thinking of it. You know, we do, especially with our schools, we do so much school safety training and they have to run these lockdown drills, which is a whole nother topic about how bad those usually are.
Yeah.
But somewhere in those drills, there's some bullet comment that says call 911. Just like when I took a CPR course when I was 16. But we really don't train people that when they make that call, what's the most important piece of information to give? And instead, they get on the call, which makes your job so much harder because you've got some frantic caller saying things like, oh my God, Jimmy Jones, he just got fired and he came back, and none of that information matters. What matters is we've got an active killer and that he's in the front hallway, right? So that's training those people what the most important piece of information actually would make your job easier. So that's what we do in our CRAK program, which is our civilian response to active killers. We start teaching them the concept of shaving seconds and how they can actually start saving lives to include their own by really knowing how to make those 911 calls. And there's obviously a lot more there, but that's the beginning part of it.
But I do think, you know, that is something that is really overlooked. And in the world of emergency response is like we train fire drills, we train, you know, earthquake drills for California, we train lockdown drills in schools,
right?
But we do not talk about past like kindergarten and having to report a 911 call because the house is on fire. Right. We don't train that anymore. We don't talk about what you believe is important in your emergency. It's not necessarily what I need from you at the start of this call. Like we can get to Billy did XYZ if it's just a standard call after the questions that I need answered are answered, you know? But you're right. If we don't train folks to make that 911 call, because I do think that it's been simplified over the years, is that you just hit those 3 buttons, someone will teleport there and it's all good. Right. But there's so much teamwork between the dispatcher and the citizen, like you said, in those first moments, that the quicker I can get that information from you in any type of call for service, it could be the difference between saving a life and not.
Yeah, those seconds matter, obviously, especially in that active killer incident. But that's exactly why we need to train across all 3 spectrums, from the people that are on scene to the people that are receiving the calls to the people that are showing up on the scene to stop the threat. And yet, unfortunately, the majority of our training is done just with those police officers, and it just focuses on what they're going to do when they get inside the building. And again, I was one of them, so I know that that's important. But if the data tells us that 50% of the time it doesn't even come into play, then why are we putting all of our training time into those areas? It just doesn't make sense.
That's so true. And I think one of the awesome things about someone like you creating this training program, and when you speak to dispatchers that, yes, you were a state trooper, but in your state trooper situation, you also were a dispatcher. You dispatched, you worked the desk. And I think that's helpful for folks to know that it's someone giving you training, feedback, information
Sure.
that gets it, that has done it as well, even though it wasn't their main employment. It was part of their role as well. And I think that's extremely helpful for folks to have that buy-in, because you've done the job of a dispatcher. You've answered the calls, and you've also, responded on scene. So I would imagine that is helpful in creating this program and reaching dispatchers.
It is, absolutely. And oftentimes, especially around New England, I'll have a co-instructor with me who is one of our lead trainers at our dispatch academy. And but she's still in the field and still working, so it's she only gets so much time off. But if I can bring some other expertise with me, then I certainly do. But it's just such a valuable conversation, and it's just the beginning of it, right? There's so many habits after that initial script that come into play where we waste time. There's policies that are offline. There's actions that those officers could be doing long before they actually get on scene, which also have the ability to shave seconds and save lives. And that's really what we bring into the training.
That's so awesome. So where do folks find you? How do they get in contact with you? How can they go to one of your classes, courses, bring it to their department?
Sure. It's our website is very simple. It's the RAKacademy.com. So it's RAK, which is response to active killers, right? Because we know that even though guns are still the most likely weapon, they're using other instruments, they're having cutting devices, they're stealing trucks and driving them through a crowd of people, or they're using bombs. So that's why we use this term of active killer instead of just active shooter. And that's why the company is the RAK Academy, RAK, for that. And if you go to the calendar on there, you'll see where I have all our training events. We're pretty filled for the springtime. We've already run probably 5 or 6 DRACs during the spring in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut. We'll be in Tennessee at the end of June. We'll be in North Carolina. We'll be back in North Carolina because we've already been there in the end of August. And I don't have them posted yet, but come next fall, we'll be in Connecticut again, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. Those are all our frequent ones. But we've been all over the country. We've been in Montana, California. It's pretty easy. The concepts are pretty easy to apply, regardless where we're at. But we make them specific for your dispatch situation and for who's in the room. But unfortunately, the gaps that we see in the blind spots are all too familiar, regardless on who's actually doing it.
Awesome. So what advice would you give someone, as we're wrapping it up, who is considering a career in law enforcement or a first responder role in general?
This answer has kind of changed over the last few years, but now I think where we're at is, I would say, get in. This is a great opportunity. And I know it's no secret that, there was a defund the police movement, and, we've been the attack and the focus on, a lot of things, which some rightfully so we needed to improve on, but some that were just totally blown out of proportion. But, the time you want to buy a house is when the market is low. And although we're in some really tough times for law enforcement right now, which is why recruiting is so low, which is you're seeing signing bonuses and you're seeing pensions being brought back and some benefits being given because it is so hard getting people. Well, if you have a passion, if you have a purpose, because that's what this has to be, it has to be a calling for you, then now is actually a great time to get in when, the housing market is low, right? Get in now because it's already turning. And, pretty much across the board, I think the military went through the same thing around the Vietnam area where they were underappreciated. They were spat on. They were misunderstood. And then once they turn that corner, I think we're in a place where our military will never be taken for granted again. And I think law enforcement is probably going through that same thing. They were getting uh, misunderstood and focused at and blamed for a lot of things. And some we need to own, right? We need to constantly get better, right? So much is focused on this police reform. And, I also do some leadership training. And when I say that to a group of officers, like, you can feel the frustration. But the reality is our job is way too complex and way too important for us to not ever be in a constant state of police reform. I just prefer to call it police evolution, right? We should be constantly evolving and getting better. And when we don't do that, then we have other people that don't know our jobs try and come in and do that. But as far as getting into law enforcement right now, the opportunities are better than they ever were. When I applied, there were 12,000 applicants for about 300 recruit positions, right? Just to get into the academy. Now, those numbers are nowhere near that, which means you can use that to your advantage. So our departments are extremely young. Their numbers are low as anything, and it's going to be that way for a few years. But once we start to get back to what right is, those people that have gotten in now are going to have seniorities. They're going to be running the departments, and they're going to be well on their way. And they're going to be taking advantage of the fact that recruiting is so tough right now. So I would absolutely recommend that if somebody has that sense of purpose, now is actually a great time to get in, especially because it's going to take you probably 6 months to a year to get through the process anyways. We're going to be in a different place come that time. Just like a year ago, we were in a little bit worse place as far as law enforcement goes.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that, it's been a weird couple years. I've always wanted to be in law enforcement. I got my degrees in criminal justice. And then when I finally decided to go into the field and ended up being a dispatcher, it did have that shift where we were having these conversations, hard conversations, and having to own some instances in historical, situations with departments. And, I think the phrase "get in" is kind of, it's so simple and so true, because you get in and you make changes, you make departments better, you affect communities. And the only way to really do that is by, being under the headset, or, being in the patrol car, or in whatever aspect you want to affect that change. But if you're not in it, it's very hard to affect any change in it.
Absolutely. And when we speak of change, I think one of the greatest changes that still has to happen, it's starting to catch on. I don't know if your department has done this yet, but dispatchers, telecommunicators, they need to be considered first responders, right? The days of putting them as an administrative position is just insane. We have learned too much, not only about how valuable their role is, how they can actually save lives, and they do every single day, but the amount of trauma that they incur, which means you should not have to do 35, 40 years as a dispatcher. It's asking way too much of somebody. If you want to, that's different than having to. And you should have the same benefits as every other first responder, because that's how valuable you are to our position. And anybody out there that I can help fight that battle, we're still trying to go through it in Connecticut, but please, if I can help you, let me know, because that's how valuable you are.
Awesome. Well, Dan, thank you so much for everything you've done, everything you do. I think the RAK Academy is amazing. I think the mission is incredible, and the information that you're providing is needed, as you say, to save lives, to shave seconds and save lives. And thank you so much for wanting to come on the show and share all this information with the listeners.
Absolutely. And thank you. And thank you for what you do, not only behind the desk, but behind the microphone right here. It's so awesome. So let's stay in touch.
Awesome. Thank you. I'll be right back with you, Dan.
Sounds good.
All right, everybody. That was another episode here on Let's Talk Dispatch. Like I said in the opening, the active shooter, active killer call is one that I think every dispatcher would prefer to go their whole career without having to take. But the reality is that it's becoming more and more common. And as Dan pointed out, that we really need to include dispatchers in these active shooter trainings, these active killer trainings, because they are the first point of contact in any report for any type of active killer situation or any large call for service. So if your department is not including them, it really is a disservice to the community that you are serving. So folks, if you are interested, again, check out Dan's website, RAK, that's Robert Adam King Academy.com. And I'll also include that information in the link for this episode. Until next time, stay raspy, everybody. Thanks for joining us here on Let's Talk Dispatch. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave a 5-star review. Consider joining our Patreon for exclusive content, early access to episodes, and discounts on merch at theraspydispatcher.com. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. All of these things help support the creation of more content, because the world needs more dispatchers. Thank you all again for the love and continued support, and until next time, stay raspy.